Chapter 4, Two Old Women, page 45. Nights passed when they had managed to build shelters were nothing compared to this one, for women were so tired they could barely move. In blind determination, they stumbled about gathering spruce boughs for their beds and large chunks of wood for their campfire. Finally, they huddled together and stared as it hypnotized into the orange glaze they ignited from the live coals they carried from their campsite. Soon they slipped mindfully off to sleep. They did not hear the lonesome howl of the distant wolf, and before they knew it, the cold air of morning brought them back to their senses. They had fallen asleep leaning against one another. Somehow managed they stayed in that position all night because they were sitting up on their legs. The women knew that getting up would not be easy. They sat still for a long time, and then Sa made an effort to rise, but her legs had lost all their feeling. She grunted and tried again, and meanwhile Chagdasa closed her eyes tightly and pretended to be asleep. She did not want to face the day. Sa gathered little courage to force herself to move, but the aches of her bones proved to be too much this time. Again, they had pushed their bodies beyond their limits. Without meaning to, Sa let out a painful moan, and she felt the urge to cry. She hung her head, defeated by all they had been through these past few days, and the cold made her feel even more despair. As much as she wanted to, her body would not move. She was too stiff. Chagdasa listened lethargically to her friend's sniffles. She was amazed that she could sit and listen to Sa cry and feel no emotion. Perhaps it was not meant for them to go on. Perhaps the young ones were right. She and Sa were fighting the inevitable. It would be so easy for them to snuggle deeper into their warm fur clothing and fall asleep, and they would not have to prove anything to anyone anymore. Perhaps the sleep that Sa feared would not be so bad after all. At least, Chagdasa thought to herself, it would not be as bad as this. Yet, for a little while, as her old friend had, Sa possessed enough determination for both of them. Shrugging off the cold and the pain in her sides and her empty stomach and the numbness in her legs, she struggled up, and this time she succeeded. As had become her morning habit, she limped around the campsite until feeling slowly began to course through her bloodstream. When circulation returned, there was more pain, but Sa concentrated her attention on gathering more food to build the fire. Then she boiled a rabbit head to make a tasty broth. Chagdasa watched all of this between her narrow lids. She did not want her friend to know that she was awake, for then Chagdasa felt she would be obligated to move, and she did not want to move. Not now, not ever. She would stay exactly where she was, or perhaps death would steal her away quickly, away from the suffering. But her body was not ready to give up just yet. Instead of slipping blissfully into oblivion, Chagdasa suddenly felt an urgent need to relieve her bladder. She tried to ignore this, but soon her bladder could wait no more, and with a loud grunt she felt her bladder let go. In a quick panic, she jumped and headed for the willows, startling her friend. When Chagdasa saw her come out of the willows looking guilty, Sa tilted her head in wonder. "Is something wrong, Chagdasa?" Feeling embarrassed, admittedly, I surprised myself on how fast I could move. I didn't think I would be able to move at all. Sa was thinking of the day ahead. After we have eaten, we should try to move on, even if we only go a little further today. Each step brings us closer to go where we are going. Although I do not feel good today, my mind has power over my body, and it wants us to move on instead of staying here to rest, which is what I want to do. Chagdasa listened as she ate her portion of the rabbit head broth, and she too felt like staying here for a while. In fact, she desperately wanted to stay. But after putting aside her foolish thoughts, she felt ashamed and reluctantly agreed that they should move on. Sa felt a slight disappointment when Chagdasa agreed to resume their journey, wondering if deep within her she had hoped Chagdasa would refuse to move. But it was soon too late for second thoughts, so both women tied the ropes around their thin waists and pulled onward. And as they walked, they kept their eyes open for signs of animals, for food was nearly gone. The meat was their prime source of energy, and without it, the struggle would be over soon. Sometimes the women would stop to discuss the route that they had chosen and ask themselves if it was the correct way. But the river led in only one direction, from the slough. So the women walked along the river bank as they kept a lookout for the creek that would lead them to the remembered place, for it was plentiful of fish long ago. The days dragged on, and the women slowly pulled their sleds across the deep snow. On the sixth day, Sa, who'd grown accustomed to staring dully on the path ahead, happened to glance up, and across the river she saw an opening in the creek. "We are there," she said in a soft, breathless voice. Chagdasa looked at her friend in the creek, "Except we are on the wrong side." Sa had managed to smile to her friend, who always seemed to find a negative side of the situation. Too tired to offer the lighter point of view, Sa sighed to herself as she motioned to her friend to follow. This time the two women did not worry about hidden cracks beneath the ice. They were too tired. Mindless of the danger, they crossed the frozen river and kept right on going up to the tributary. The women walked until late into the night, and the moon showed emerging over the trees until it hovered above them, lighting their way along the narrow creek. Although they had walked more hours than earlier in the day, the women continued on, and they felt sure the old campsite was near to where they wanted to reach their destination by night. Just about the time Chagdasa was ready to beg her friend to stop, she saw the campsite. "Look over there. There are the fish racks we hung so long ago." Sa stopped and suddenly felt weak. It was with great effort that she stood on her shaking legs, for she felt somehow they had suddenly overwhelmed her. Chagdasa looked closer to her friend and gently placed her arm around, and they looked at each other and felt a surge of powerful emotion that left them both speechless. They had traveled all this way by themselves. Good memories came back to them about a place that they had shared much happiness with their friends and family. Now, because of the ugly twist of fate, they were here alone, betrayed by those same people. Because they were thrown together in this hardship, the two women had developed a sense of knowing what the other was thinking, and Sa was usually the more sensitive one. "It is better not to think of why we are here," she said, "but we must set up our camp here tonight. Tomorrow we will talk." Clearing the bitter emotion from her throat, Chagasa heartily agreed. So, with slow, dragging movements, the two women climbed up on the low bank of the creek and walked up to the campsite, where they found an old tent frame that they used for the shelter for the night. Though their clothing shielded them from the awful cold, the caribou skins did a better job. Coals from the fire pulsated amidst the ash all throughout the whole night, and the shelter kept warm. Finally, the morning, the cold seeped through and the women began to stir. Sa was the first to move. This time her body did not protest so much as she moved about the shelter, placing the wood that she had gathered the night before on the tiny embers still burning in the fireplace. After a few moments of blowing slowly on the dried sticks, a flame began its gentle dance as it spread into the bundle of dry willows, and soon the shelter was warm and glowing. That day the women worked steadily, unmindfully of their aching joints. They knew they would have to hurry and make final preparations for the worst part of the winter, for even colder weather lay ahead. So they spent the day piling snow high around the shelter to insulate it and gather all those loose wood they could find. Then, without resting, they set long line of rabbit snares, for the area was rich in willow, and there were many signs of rabbit life. Nighttime had arrived when the women made their way back to camp. Sa boiled the remains of the rabbit innards, and the women feasted on the last of their food. After that, they leaned against the bedding and stared at the campfire. The two women had not known each other well before they had been abandoned. They had each been neighbors who had thrived on each other's bad habits of complaining and sharing conversations about things that did not matter. Now their old age and their cruel fate were all they had in common. So it was in the night at the end of their painful journey together that they did not know how to converse in companionship, and instead each woman dwelled in their own thoughts. Chickasaws' mind went immediately to her daughter and her grandson. She wondered if they were all right. A surge of hurt streaked through her as she thought about her daughter again. It was still hard for Chickasaw to believe that her own flesh and blood would refuse to come and aid her, and self-pity overwhelmed her. Chickasaw fought the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes, and her lips formed a thin, rigid line. She would not cry. This was the time to be strong and forget. But with that thought, a huge, simple tear trickled down, and she saw, and she was also in deep thought. Chickasaw was perplexed by her friend. Except for the few moments of weakness, the woman next to her seemed so strong and sure of herself, almost as if she was challenged by all this. Curiosity replaced the pain, and Sa was startled when Chickasaw spoke. Once when I was a girl, they left my grandmother behind. She could no longer walk and could hardly see. We were hungry people, and we had staggered around, and my mother whispered that she was afraid that the people would think of eating people. I had not heard of anything like that before, but my family told stories of someone who had grown desperate enough for such things. My heart filled with fear as I clung to my mother's hand. If someone looked into my eyes, I would have turned my head quickly, fearing they might take notice of me, of them considering eating me. That is how much fear I felt. I was hungry too, but somehow it didn't matter. Perhaps it was because I was young and I had my family all around me. When they talked about leaving my grandmother behind, I was horrified. I remembered my father and my brothers arguing with the rest of the men, but my father came back to the shelter and I looked at his face and I knew it would happen. Then I looked at my grandmother. She was blind and too deaf to hear what was going on. Chickasaw took a breath before continuing her story. When they bundled her up and put her blankets around her, I think grandmother sensed what was happening because we all began to leave camp, and I couldn't help but hear her crying. The older women shuddered with the memory. Later, when I grew up, I learned that my brother and father went back to end my grandmother's life, for they did not want her to suffer, and they burned her body in case anyone thought of filling their bellies with her flesh. Somehow we survived that winter, though my only real memory of that time was not a happy one. I remember other times of the empty stomachs, but not as bad as that one winter. Sa smiled sadly, understanding her friend's painful memories. She too remembered when I was young like a boy, she said. I was like a boy. I was always with my brothers. I learned many things from them. Sometimes my mother would try to make me sit and sew or learn what I would have to know when I became a woman, but my father and brothers always rescued me. They liked the way I was. She smiled at her memories. Our family was different than most. My father and mother let us do almost anything. We did chores like everyone else, but after they were done, we could explore. I never played with the other children, only my brothers. I'm afraid I did not know what growing up was about because I was having so much fun. When my mother asked me if I had become a woman yet, I didn't understand. I thought she meant in age, not in any other way. And summer after summer, she would look at me and ask the same question, and each time she looked at me worried. I did not pay much attention to her, for I grew tall as my mother and just a little shorter than my brothers. People looked at me in a strange way. Girls younger than me are already with children, and yet I still was free like a child. Sa laughed heartily, knowing that she received all those strange looks from people then. I began to hear them laugh behind my back, and I became confused. In a way, I didn't care what people thought of me, so I continued to hunt, fish, explore, and do what I pleased. My mother tried to make me stay home and work, but I rebelled, and my brothers had taken women, and I told my mother I had plenty of help. She had plenty of help, and I would escape. When my mother turned to my father to discipline me, I would show up with a huge bundle of ducks, fish, or some other food. My father would say, "Leave her alone." Then I grew older, beyond the age that women should have a man and a child, and everyone was talking about me. I could not understand why, though, for I was not with a man or having children. I was still doing my share of the work and providing food. There were times when I brought more food than a man. This did not seem to please them. But this time in my life, we experienced our worst winter, and it was cold like this, Sa motioned. Even babies died, and grown men began to panic, for as hard as they tried, they could not find enough animals to eat. There was an old woman in our group I rarely noticed, and the chief decided that we had to move on in search of food. There was a rumor that far away we would find caribou, and that excited everyone. The woman had to be carried, and the chief did not want this burden, so he told everyone that we would leave her behind. No one argued except me. My mother tried to stifle me, but I was young and unthinking, and she told me that what was to be done was best for the whole group. She seemed like a cold, unfeeling stranger as she tried to talk to me about my protest, but I angrily brushed her off. I was shocked and furious. I felt the people were being lazy and they were not thinking clearly. It was my job to talk some sense into them, and I began who I was. I spoke up for the woman who I hardly even knew existed then. I asked if the men thought that they were no better than the wolves who would shun the old and weak. The chief was a cruel man, and I avoided him until that day, and I stood behind him and shouted angry words into his face. I could see that he was twice as angry as I was, but I could not stop myself, and even though I knew that the chief disliked me, I argued on, not listening to him as I tried to answer my own accusations. His actions were wrong, and I meant to it right. As I continued to talk, I was unaware of the shock that awakened from the group, of the malnourished lethargy. A fearful look fell upon the chief's face, and he put a large hand over my mouth. "All right, strange young girl," he said in a large voice. I knew I was bent to humiliate me. I could feel my chin go up farther. "You will stay with the old one," and I could hear my mother gasp, and her heart sank, yet I would not yield. And unblinking into his eyes. My family was deeply hurt, but my pride and shame kept me from protesting. They did not want a daughter who would take such a stand against strong leaders of the group. I did not think that the leaders were strong. The chief acted as if I didn't exist after that. I was ignored by everyone except my family, who begged me to apologize to the leader, but I would not give in. My pride grew with each moment the others pretended that I was not here, and I continued to plead for the old woman's life. Sa broke into laughter with an impetuous youth. "What happened after that?" Chickasaw wanted to know. Sa paused deeply and inhaled in the pain from the long-ago memories. Continuing in a subdued voice, "After they left, I was not so brave. There were no animals to be found for miles around, and I was determined to show that what could be done by my good intentions. So the old woman, I never did know her name, for I was too busy to keep us trying to be alive, and I ate mice and owls and anything else that moved. I killed it, we ate it. The woman died that winter, and I was alone. Not even my pride and usual carefree ways could help me. I talked to myself all the time. Who else was there? And they would think I was crazy if the people returned to find me talking in the air. At least you and I have each other." Sa, her old friend, nodded, wholehearted in agreement. Then I realized the importance of being with a large group. The body needs food, but the mind needs people. When the sun finally came hot and long on the land, I explored the country, and one day I was walking and talking to myself as usual, and someone said, "Who are you talking to?" And for a moment I thought I was hearing things. I stopped in my tracks and turned around to find a strong-looking man with his arms crossed, smiling in a bold manner. Many feelings ran through me at the moment. I was surprised and embarrassed and angry all at once. "You scared me," I said, trying to cover up my real feelings. Because my cheeks were burning, I knew I did not fool him, for his grin grew deeper. He asked me what I was doing out there alone, and I told him my story. I felt at that moment that I could trust him, and he told me the same thing had happened to him, only he was banished because he was fool enough to fight over a woman who was meant for another man. We were together for a long time before we were a man and woman together. I never saw my family again, and it was years later that we joined a band. Then he tried to fight with a bear and he died. "Foolish man," he said with growing admiration and sadness weighing down her face. It was Tugdasa for the first time saw her friend so sad. You were luckier than I when you became a parent that I was not interested in taking a man. I was forced to live with a man much older than I was. I hardly even knew him. It was years before we had children. A child. He was older than I am now when he died. Sa laughed. The people would have chosen a man for me to marry too, had I been with him much longer. After a momentary silence, she continued, Now here we are, truly old. I hear our bones creaking, and we left behind to fend for ourselves. The women fell into silence as they struggled with their emotion. They lay on their warm beds, and the cold earth trembled outside. The thought and experiences they had shared, as they felt exhausted into sleep, the women felt more at home because of the knowledge they had, and because they had survived the hard times. Days shortened as the sun sank deeper under the horizon. It grew cold, and there were times when the women jumped into the trees around them, cracked loudly from the cold pressure. Even the willows snapped, but the women settled down. They also became depressed. They feared the savage wolves that howled in the distance. Other imagined fears tormented them as well, for there was plenty of time to think as the dark days drifted by slowly. In what daylight they had, the two women forced themselves to move. They spent their waking hours collecting firewood from underneath the deep snow. Though food was scarce, warmth was their main concern, and at night they would sit and talk, trying to keep each other from their loneliness and fears that threatened to overcome them. The people rarely spent precious time talking idle conversation, and when they did speak, it was to communicate rather than to socialize. But these women made an exception during the long evenings. They talked, and a sense of mutual respect developed as they learned of each other's past and hardships. Many days went by before the women caught more rabbits. It had been some time since they had eaten a full meal, and they managed to preserve their energy by boiling spruce boughs to serve as a minty tea, and they made their stomachs sour. Knowing it was dangerous to eat anything solid after such a diet, the two women first boiled the rabbit meat to make a nourishing broth, and they drank it very slowly. After a day of drinking broth, the women cautiously ate only one ham of the rabbit, and they passed, and then they allowed themselves to eat more portions, and soon their energy was restored. With the wood pile high around the shelter like a barricade, the women found that they had more time to forage for food. The hunting skills they had learned in their youth reemerged, and each day the women could walk farther from their shelter to set rabbit snares to keep out an eye for animals small enough to kill. One of the rules had been taught is if you snare an animal, you put out snares for animals, you must check them regularly. Neglecting your snare line brought bad luck, so despite the cold and their own physical discomforts, the two old women checked their snares each day and usually found a rabbit to reward them. At nightfall, when their daily chores were completed, the women wove rabbit furs into blankets and clothing and made mittens and face coverings. Sometimes, to break the monotony, one would present a woven rabbit fur hat or mittens to each other. They had always brought wide smiles. As the days slowly passed, the weather lost its cold edge, and the women savored those moments of glee. They had survived the winter. They regained what energy they had lost, and now they kept busy collecting more firewood, checking the rabbit snares, and scouting the vast area for other animals. Though the women had lost the habit of complaining, they grew tired of the daily fare of rabbit meat and found themselves dreaming of game to eat, such as willow grouse, tree squirrels, or even beaver meat. And one morning, Chagdasa awoke and felt something wasn't quite right. Her heart pumped rapidly as she got up, fearing the worst, and peeked out of the shelter. At first all seemed still, and then suddenly she spotted a flock of willow grouse pecking at the tree debris that had fallen not far away. With a trembling hand, she quietly got a long, thin babachi out of her sewing bag and slowly crept out of the tent. Selecting a stick from a nearby woodpile, she fashioned a noose on the end and began to crawl towards the flock. Nervously, the birds startled and clucked and became aware of the woman's presence. Knowing that birds were about to take flight, Chidasa stopped a few minutes to give them time to calm down. They were not too far away now, and she hoped Sa would not awake to find the noise and scare the birds. With her knees aching and her hands slightly trembling, Chidasa slowly pushed the stick forward, and somehow a grouse excitedly flew away into another patch of willows nearby. But she steadily ignored them as she continued to lift the stick slowly on the remaining birds and walked about faster. Chigdasa concentrated on the grouse closest to her, and it made small movements towards the noose as its head moved back and front. As the birds startled noisily to run on, fly off, Chigdasa shoved the noose forward, and the bird's head slipped right into it, and she jerked the stick upward, and the bird squawked and twisted until it was motionless. Standing up with a dead grouse in her hand, Chigdasa turned toward the tent to find her friend's face wreathed in smiles. Chigdasa smiled back. Looking into the air, Chigdasa took note of the warmth in the air. "The weather gets better," Sa said finally. The older woman's eyes widened in surprise. "I should have noticed. It hadn't been so cold. I would have frozen in my position like a sneaky fox." The women found great laughter in this, and they went back into their shelter to prepare the meat for a different season to come. After the morning, the weather fluctuated between bitter cold and warm and snowy days. That the women did not catch another bird to dampen their spirits, for days gradually grew longer, warmer, and brighter.